This is Central Park. It is one of the most recognizable chunks of land on this planet, surrounded by the most important city in the world. But once there was a time that Central Park could have looked completely different. What it is today was never an inevitability. Just one of multiple plans that could have just as easily been a reality. In the 1850s, Manhattan was different. A bunch of six-story buildings with uptown barely developed. But its people weren't naive. The city was the largest in the country. Its population was growing. A deadly cholera outbreak, industrial pollution, and high-density tenement housing were showing the limits to the space at the tip of the island. Wealthy New Yorkers had already escaped for the north, but they were going to be followed. If there was any time to think about how to use the less developed land uptown, it was now.
I will merely say that every American who visits London, whether for the first or the 15th time, feels mortified that no city in the United States has a public park. What are called parks in New York are not even apologies for the things. They are only squares or paddocks.
In the 1850s, the city had around 17 public squares, totaling about 65 hectares. These were better than nothing. Extrapolating them to the 21st century, though, they left much to be desired. This is what Manhattan would look like today if no major park developed. Tiny green islands in an ocean of gray. The battle was not over the need for green space. The battle was over where.
If the public authorities, who expend so much of our money in laying out the city, would do what is in their power, they might give our vast population an extensive pleasure ground of shade and recreation.
William Cullen Bryant was a poet and the lead editor of the New York Evening Post. He was also one of the most outspoken about the need for a park. He also knew exactly where it should go.
On the road to Harlem, between 68th Street on the south and 77th on the north, and extending from 3rd Avenue to the East River, is a tract of beautiful woodland, comprising 60 or 70 acres, thickly covered with old trees, intermingled with a variety of shrubs. The surface is varied in a very striking and picturesque manner, with craggy eminences and hollows, and a little stream runs through the midst. The swift tides of the East River sweep its rocky shores, and the fresh breeze of the bay comes in on every warm summer afternoon over the restless waters. There never was a finer situation for the public garden of a great city.
Bryant recommended a forest next to East River, a place called Joneswood. Although uptown consisted of detached homes and shanty towns, Joneswood was an oasis, a large, well-maintained forest. It was owned by two wealthy New York families, the Schermerhorns and the Joneses. It had the potential to be the spot for New York's park, but only if the families who owned it were willing to let it go.
To the Honorable Common Council, the tide of population is rapidly flowing to the northern section of the island. There are places on the island easily accessible and possessing all the advantages of wood, lawn, and water, which might, at a comparatively small expense, be converted into a park. There are thousands who would rejoice in being able to breathe the pure air in such a place. There is no park on the island deserving the name.
The mayor of New York City campaigned on the need for a park. When in office, he instructed the Committee on Lands and Places to find one for him.
Your committee, having carefully considered the important subject committed to them, desire to express their hearty concurrence with the views of His Honor the Mayor. Your committee believe they have found such a one. The lands known as Jones Wood.
With this report, Kingsland and his government had made up their minds. The Schermerhorns and Joneses, though, had not.
The land is principally owned by Mr. Jones and Schermerhorn. With them, your committee has had several interviews. Your committee have not succeeded in this.
The city had a problem. They could cut off 68th Street to make the Schermerhorns happy, but then the Joneses would oppose it. They could leave the Joneses, but then their park would be divided in half. The families weren't willing to sell, unless the city considered one other option, an option rarely taken at such a scale. The state senator James Beekman owned an estate right by Joneswood. If Joneswood were made into a park, his estate would increase in value. Unsurprising to no one, he happened to be one of the park's biggest lobbyists.
Mr. Beekman, our senator, is too deeply interested in the neighborhood of the contemplated park to be an impartial judge of its feasibility. He and his family have a large amount of land there, which will be greatly augmented in value by this operation.
On June 17, 1851, he introduced a bill. This granted the city the power to gain Joneswood through eminent domain, to force the families to sell Joneswood to the government, whether they were willing to sell it or not. And he succeeded. His bill passed. Joneswood was going to be the grand new park on the island, one deserving of the name. If you visit the east side of Manhattan today, you'll find the FDR Drive, the Rockefeller University, and a bunch of high-rises. Any remnant of one of the most well-maintained forests on the island is nowhere to be found. This is what the city maybe would have looked like if Joneswood was turned into a park. Instead of the ultra-rich luxury pencil towers at 57th Street, you'd find them next to East River. But the city did agree to turn Joneswood into a park. So where is it? Only a bit more than a week after Beekman passed his bill, the Journal of Commerce published a collection of letters. In it, two men plant a seed. Instead of a park on the East River, Henry Shaw and Nicholas Dean recommend a central one, either 100 blocks from 39th Street to the Harlem River, bounded by 5th and 6th Avenue. Shaw's plan, or 600 acres from 58th to 106th Street, bounded by 5th and 7th Avenue. Dean's plan. Dean was the president of the Croton Aqueduct Board. In 1842, the city had constructed the Croton Distributing Reservoir in the middle of uptown Manhattan. Building a new park that had that reservoir inside it made sense. It started to make even more sense when there were plans to build an even larger reservoir right beside it. If that land had to be bought anyway, they could integrate those costs into the overall cost of a new park. Also, unlike Joneswood, Shaw and Dean's plans were a lot larger. And with parks, size matters.
The leading topic of town gossip and newspaper paragraphs just now, in New York, is the new park proposed by Mayor Kingsland. The commercial metropolis of a continent spacious enough to border both oceans has not been able to afford sufficient land to give its citizens. Now that public opinion has fairly settled that a park is necessary, the parsimonious declare that the plot of 160 acres proposed by Mayor Kingsland is extravagantly large. Thanking Mayor Kingsland most heartily for his proposed new park, the only objection we make is that it is too small. 500 acres is the smallest area that should be reserved for the future wants of such a city, now, while it may be obtained. 500 acres may be selected between 39th and the Harlem River, including a varied surface of land, a good deal of which is yet waste area, so that the whole may be purchased at something like $1 million. 160 acres of park for a city that will soon contain 750,000 people. It is only a child's playground.
At the time, there were basically two ways to fund large public infrastructure projects. The first was a general property tax, a burden for all. The second was through assessments, taxes on property owners in a specific area. For those the furthest away from Joneswood, like the downtown owners, the ideal form of funding came from assessments. For those closest to the park, like Beekman, the ideal funding was through general taxation. Beekman, clever man that he was, had tried to fund Joneswood entirely through general taxation. His property increased in value, while the burden was for everyone. Downtown owners weren't oblivious, though. His tactics were rejected. The solution was a combination. Half of the funding for New York's new park would come from general tax, and the other half from assessments. But Beekman, fucking Beekman, this guy still manages to convince the government to put assessment taxes on everyone uptown. Property owners who lived all the way on the west coast of the island now had to pay assessments for a park that was completely on the other side. A clever move by Beekman, but it would cost him. At the tip of Manhattan is Battery Park. Today it is around 10 hectares. In the 1800s, it was half that size. After Joneswood had been passed, there were those who now wanted to also expand the Battery. Downtown merchants didn't like this, though, and they lobbied against it.
To the Honorable Board of Aldermen, I am constrained to withhold my approval.
Kingsland rejected the expansion of Battery Park. A serious mistake. If the city wouldn't expand the Battery, then the city wouldn't have Jones Park either.
The secret of the opposition to the park was that the Battery enlargement had been defeated by the veto of the mayor, and it was now Battery versus Park.
It was at this moment of political upheaval that the seed planted by Henry Shaw and Nicholas Dean started to grow.
We are curious to know how this special committee on parks originated. We recollect the appointment of a special committee on the proposed park at Jones's Woods. But how this was metamorphosed into the plural parks we cannot say.
The aldermen who supported the expansion of the Battery formed a special committee on parks to investigate other potential areas. The fight officially started. Joneswood versus Central Park.
Central Park will have a superficial area 4 3/4 times as great as Jones's Park. Central Park will include grounds almost entirely useless for building purposes, owing to the very uneven and rocky surface.
The central part of uptown Manhattan had rugged land that was expensive to develop. A central site was larger and its land cheaper.
The difference in the cost and extent of the ground for the two parks is $1.4 million for 750 acres for Central Park, $700,000 for 150 acres for Jones's Park.
It also didn't take much of a genius to realize a big park in the middle of the island is probably more accessible than a small park on its side.
In purchasing Jones's Park, we pay for all the land included within the limits of the park, whereas in the acquisition of Central Park, we enclose an area of 750 acres for park purposes, and only have to pay for 560 acres, including ground for the new reservoir which the city will purchase in any event.
But still, during all of this, there were those who thought both were ridiculous.
The idea of ventilating the city by making a park of Joneswood is particularly deficient in sound reasoning. It is a beautiful spot, no doubt. Properly cultivated and adorned, it would make a pleasant drive and all that, for those who can afford to ride to it and through it. The suggestion of it being a reservoir of air for aiding the ventilation of the city is simply absurd. It would be like helping the flight of an eagle by giving him the wing of a butterfly. It is undeniable that the most pressing issue which our citizens, especially the poor, labor under is the character of their indoor life. If we would ventilate the city, we must begin by enlarging and ventilating the dwellings. It will be of no use to make parks, plant trees and flowers, open fountains and make elegant drives, as long as lot owners and landlords are permitted to put such cloud-capped tenements and cram them with people.
Griscom saw both parks as a distraction. Be it a central site or Joneswood, it didn't matter. Its benefits were for the wealthy and too far away from the many.
The plan proposed of a central park must necessarily aggravate these serious evils by enhancing the price of land. The wealthy alone will be able to live near it, or if dwellings are erected for the poor, they will be tenant houses or colony houses, towering to the skies and rented at enormous rates. If, however, our legislature will compel us to reserve so large a portion of our restricted area from more useful purposes, we get them to give it in divided doses. Instead of one plot of 800 acres, give 8 parks of 100 acres each, or 16 of 50 acres, and disperse them over the island, that the air, the trees, the flowers, the fountains, and the walks may be brought more within the reach of all. This would certainly be less aristocratic, more democratic, and far more conducive to public health.
This is what Manhattan would look like today with Griscom's 8 parks of 100 acres placed across the island. This is what it would look like with his 16 parks of 50 acres. Research has found that in the same area, 36 1-hectare parks have a better cooling effect than 6 6-hectare parks. To have the largest cooling effect, smaller but more distributed parks do work better. Griscom was onto something. In the 1850s, the travel times were also much longer. Not every man could afford a horse and carriage. The subway didn't exist. A big park in the center or a smaller one on its east had the same problem. Going there just wasn't worth it. For the rich, though, it was.
The most beautiful feature of a large park over a small one is that the large park is capable of being laid out into a very great length of serpentine road. A serpentine road of more than 25 miles can be wound through, Central Park. This important consideration does not, however, apply to Jones's Park.
A benefit of a larger park was that wealthy families could enjoy a long carriage drive in them. Smaller parks did not provide this. New York landowners also looked up to the grand parks in London and Paris. A bunch of small parks scattered across the island did not give their city the standing they thought it deserved.
New York should have a park of amplitude and magnificence, on a scale corresponding with her position and population.
To seal the deal, though, it had to win in the eyes of New York's wealthy landowners. Beekman's tactics had come back to bite him.
Central Park is of sufficient size to permit the selling off of portions of its border. These sites will command large prices and reduce the expense of the original cost. Jones's Park presents a comparatively small border of 1.5 miles, deducting the riverfront.
Unlike Joneswood, Central Park had more land on its boundaries that it could sell off. The landowners who didn't want to fund a park on the east side of the island now had an offer more affordable, accessible, and larger. Beekman knew Joneswood was on weak ground, but Beekman was Beekman. When the city was finally voting for a new park, again, Beekman proposed a modified bill. He had sneakily changed it so that the funding would only come through general taxes, with no benefit assessments at all. Exactly what he wanted in the first place. Beekman was excited, but the rest of the politicians were like, no. In July 1853, Central Park won and Joneswood lost. But Beekman wasn't done. He managed to pass a ceremonial bill approving Joneswood. Legislators had assumed that it was optional and that it would just be struck down in the next chamber. But Beekman had tricked them. The law he passed, he had secretly changed it. Turning Joneswood into a park wasn't a ceremonial option. It was now a requirement. Beekman got the city to approve 2 parks, Central Park and Joneswood. This is what the city would look like today if Beekman had succeeded. The Central site and Joneswood both converted into parks. What others advocated for became a reality by mistake.
But are not the two perfectly reconcilable? May not both be bought, and the Central Park made to include not only the major part of that embraced within the draft of the committee, but the whole of Jones's Wood, down to the water's edge?
There is now ample room and need enough upon the island for 2 parks, whereas, if the matter is delayed for a few years, there will hardly be a space left for 1.
Beekman's dream, however, no matter how hard he tried to make it come true, stayed a dream. His 2 most controversial political tools, to seize the land through eminent domain and fund it through a general tax, turned on him. His bill for Joneswood was struck down by a Roosevelt.
Such an application on its face is novel and extraordinary and until now, I believe, unprecedented. A garden for B's lot in the 19th Ward quadrupling its value and takes A's garden in the 5th Ward to pay for it. Compelling one party to sell but the other to buy against his will, an exercise of the power of eminent domain indicating, it must be admitted, very peculiar, if not very hasty legislation.
Joneswood was over. Central Park would be a park deserving of the name, but its position was still far from guaranteed.
Bounded southerly by 59th Street, northerly by 106th Street, easterly by 5th Avenue, and westerly by 8th Avenue.
Only a year after the park was passed, the city experienced a massive financial crisis. In the winter of 1855, the park was threatened. A board of aldermen voted 14-3 to cut off the lower 12 blocks and also 120 meters from each side. Instead of a great Central Park, a green strip. This is what Central Park would look like today if this had happened. A pretty big letdown for a park that only a few years ago had been prized for its ambitious size. Luckily, this reduction was vetoed by the mayor. Nothing short of incredible. One decision by a handful of men could have changed the face of New York City forever. It only took one man to stop it. From Beekman to Griscom, one park to many and small to large, Central Park as the world knows it today was born from struggle. Even after the central site was finally determined and the fight seemed over, another battle was just getting started. A battle over what it should look like on the inside. That story is fascinating, but that battle will have to be told another time.